Yes, we are live.
Good evening to you all. I welcome you to today's Thursday session on gender and sexuality. I'm Kiran Keshamurthy, and I currently teach English at the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Guwahati. Today, it gives me great pleasure in welcoming you to listen to today's speaker, an old friend of mine. Our friendship goes back to our Berkeley days in California, Preeti Shekar. Preeti Shekar is a feminist journalist, writer, and activist with more than a decade of work experience in independent journalism, radio production, and print media, non-profit communications, and women's human rights. She's currently a contributing editor for Reimagine Race, Poverty, and the Environment, a journal and a regular producer of two shows on the oldest progressive radio station in the US. Since 2018, Preeti works with Equality Labs, a transnational Dalit feminist organization, as their fundraising director. She's also worked with various Bay Area, California-based social justice organizations. She's written for numerous publications in the US and in India, including The Hindu, Trikon Magazine, Race, Poverty and the Environment, Foreign Policy in Focus, India West, India Currents, and others. She's also been a radio producer with KPFA 94.1 FM since 2005, producing shows, interviews, and commentaries focused on a range of social and environmental justice issues. Preeti is also a consultant with the Institute for South Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, the Third Eye South Asian Film Festival. Preeti is also on the board of San Francisco Women Against Rape, the oldest radical feminist organization in the US, working to end all forms of sexual violence against women and trans communities. Previously, she has served on the board of Media Alliance, one of the leading media advocacy groups in the US. She's also interviewed various women's rights and social justice activists, both grassroots activists as well as public figures, including the Nobel Peace Prize winner, the late Wangari Maathai, Goldman Prize winners, including the late and celebrated Berta Cáceres, filmmakers like Meera Nair, Deepa Mehta, journalists like Katha Pollitt and Amy Goodman, and so on. She's also deeply passionate about women's rights, enabling and covering women's leadership, and has trained several young women of color in technical and journalistic aspects of radio production. During her tenure as the executive director of Narika, one of the foremost South Asian domestic violence prevention agencies in California, she played a critical role in recruiting and enabling young women to be anti-violence advocates and helped make vital organizational linkages around LGBT rights, women's rights, immigration, and other family violence. Currently, she's based in Chennai, India, and in the Bay Area. That's around San Francisco, California. Her talk today is entitled Movement Media and How to Make It Happen. So welcome to you, Preeti Shekar. Thank you very much for coming today, and we look forward to listening to you.
Okay, and that was like a really long bio. I should have sent you a shorter version.
No, but it's a great one.
Thank you for this opportunity. I've been attending a lot of webinars and trying to shy away from doing these. So,
sorry to interrupt. Just a small request. Is it possible to increase the lighting or something in your room? The light or something? Is it?
No, the light is not working well. But
okay, that's fine. Yeah. Okay. All right. Yeah. So please.
Maybe I'll try to move to a different part of the room. Anyway, should I turn off my video, or does this video make sense to have on?
No, you can just keep speaking. It's fine. It's all right. Yeah.
So hello everyone. Thank you, Kiran, for this lovely opportunity. It's a great moment for me to stop and reflect on all the different media work that's happening.
Yeah.
That I've been doing in the context of what's happening in India and globally.
Sorry, you'll have to just speak up a little bit. Yeah.
Louder? Okay.
Yes, please.
Better?
Yes.
So before, since this is a small enough group, I was wondering if by a show of hand, y'all can, those of you who are journalists or worked in media, can raise your hand digitally on this, or can raise your hand on this chat so that I get a sense of who also is a journalist. So far, no one? I guess no one, because I don't see any hands go up. Okay. So for me, one of the things that I thought this talk would be interesting is to focus on, I trained as a journalist, worked in media in India with The Hindu as a reporter. And then when I went to the US to pursue a master's in women's studies, I was all geared up to have a career in academia. And when I finished my master's, I realized that I wanted to go back to working in journalism. And um, but the thing is, at that time, I was like interested in combining my background in feminism and journalism. So I started working in independent media. And by independent media, I meant non-corporate media that is not underwritten by companies, right? So, and that there was at that time, there was a vibrant scene of progressive media that had some funding as well typically from foundations. And I incidentally happened to run into someone who worked for a radio station, and they were just starting a feminist program. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of my, like you heard Kiran's bio about me, but to just share a little bit about the details, so that will be a jumping off point to talk about what is movement media and movement journalism, and why it's necessary in today's age and today's current political context in India and globally. So I started working for a radio station called KPFA, which is a local FM station based out of Berkeley in Northern California, which is where I met Kiran. And one of the things that KPFA is proud about is it's a community radio station where all the way the radio is supported is through community donations and some grants that they apply and get. They don't take any corporate underwriting. So which means they are completely independent, and they also are open to community members to come and train. So one of the barriers that has always been there in journalism, in fields like journalism and media, is the entry point, right? Like you either have to go to journalism school or you have to know people in media. And in India, it's extremely still very elitist, mm, especially when you look at the caste segregation around who gets to work in the media and which media and so on, right? I won't even go into television media; it's a whole other nightmare. So one of the things, this particular station that I worked with was committed to was making sure different communities, especially working class communities, had access to producing radio, telling their own stories on air, right? And you have to think about this 20 years ago, when now we have social media, and social media is on your phone, and everybody, lot more people have access to instantly putting a story out or an image out, right, on social media, on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram and what have you. But back in the day, 15 years ago, radio was still a very powerful medium to get your voice heard, literally. And for me, I think that was the starting point of really doing stories where I felt I could have conversations with people I wanted to engage with. And as somebody with a background in feminism, in journalism, I wanted to marry the two and interview a lot of feminist scholars about their work. And those of you who are academics will know that there's plenty of great scholarship out there that, especially be it in humanities or the sciences, very little of it makes it to a mainstream audience in terms of um, engaging with the knowledge that is being produced. And for me, I was interested in how we can bring feminist scholarship to a wider audience engagement. So I started my radio career with interviewing primarily feminist scholars, South Asian feminist scholars, and on their books, on their works that they had published. And it was pretty fulfilling. The only challenge I think with that is academics like to speak in academia. So for me, what I mean by feminist media making and feminist journalism is really trying to break down complex academic analysis into a more accessible language and connect it with day-to-day experiences, where there's a lot of abstract scholarship out there, but the ones that have relevance to our day-to-day lives. I think there's still a lot of work to be done in terms of making that scholarship accessible, right? Um, so, so from there, I graduated to then interviewing a lot of artists, filmmakers, um, because I also started volunteering with a film festival based in the Bay Area. And every year they had about a lineup of 20 to 30 films. So, and some of them were really cutting edge, interesting, shining a light on different aspects of history of the South Asian subcontinent. So, both somewhat mainstream filmmakers as well as independent and small time local filmmakers. So, One of the things I also was committed to doing was amplify the voices of women and diverse women, not just women with privilege, but also women, working class women, women of color, Black women, and South Asian women who are also doing very interesting work in the US or transnationally. I think now the transnational piece has grown because there's much more transnational work happening, movements happening. So back then, that for me was a priority. And one of the things I realized was also how you engage and how you interview different experts also varies a lot by gender and other aspects of your identity. Uh, I noticed, after I did like 10 or 15 interviews, that oftentimes I had to sit down and prep women experts more than I had to men, for example. Women always preface what they said with, I think, I'm not sure. And I think for radio, it's all about conversations, right? The best radio is actually when you get someone to share something where it doesn't feel scripted, or um, it doesn't feel like you're reading, like I'm just taking a piece of text and reading it, as opposed to like telling something organically like this. It makes for more interesting listening. And in radio, we also say that people always listen with one ear because they're always usually doing something when you're listening to radio. So keeping all these barriers in mind around radio as a medium, and I trained in print media and worked with the newspaper, as my starting point of my career. So switching to radio meant like trying to be a good conversationalist. And I think now we have the world of podcasting, and I'll get into that a little bit later. World of podcasting has exploded, and we all are hooked onto our phones for all kinds of media, and we are now saturated. But 15 years ago, that wasn't the case, right? You had limited media, you had the big newspapers, you had some blogs, and then you had the radio. And the radio still remains, I think, a very powerful medium. And I think, some of you might know of how community radio in India is also coming up as a very powerful way to disperse information quickly, particularly in the context of COVID now. A lot of radio stations have stepped up. As I was trying even research for today, saw that how community radio has been a pretty powerful force in places like Nepal and other remote parts of India to get the word out. So radio remains a very powerful medium, and I wanted to encourage those of us who are interested in media making, no matter what field you are in. And one of the primary roles of media was to hold the state accountable, institutions accountable, ensure as a functioning, ensure the democracy is functioning, right? But I think given the level of impunity that has just grown, say, both in India as well as, say, in a country like the US, I think what we call movement journalism is about amplifying the voices of groups on the ground doing work around social justice, racial justice, ending caste-based violence. I mean, right now we just see the huge, media attention on, the gang rape cases that are happening. But even though it may seem like sensationalist or limited, it's it. I think in the case of Indian media, I find it hard to predict what will get picked up as news and what sustains interest. And we're also battling with a highly tabloidization of media, right? We have, heavily the television news media has really, I think, deteriorated the quality of journalism. So I think what we need anymore is journalism that is about ensuring that it's serving the least common, the most impacted communities, and that for me is what movement journalism is all about. Those of you, if you've gone to journalism school, you learn about objectivity and neutrality. I myself have done a lot of work in what is called non-profit communications, and by that I mean communications work for organizations doing specific work to amplify the work both to funders and to their constituencies. But I feel like what I've been unintentionally doing is being a movement journalist. And that means writing about social justice movements with the lens that, my bias is that this is needed and necessary. And I don't think there is anything called objectivity. There is always a bias that we all carry that is, that comes from the identities, from how we are raised, from our socialization, in so many aspects, right? What we read, how we filter. And so I think it's important to um, have a movement-based approach to looking at both when we read stories as well as when we seek to cover them. Um, the other thing I wanted, before I get into podcasting, I wanted to play a small clip from the radio show. So one of the radio shows I worked for was called Apex Express, and it focused on the South Asian community in the Bay Area, but also looked at issues broadly affecting South Asians in the US. And some of the fun things that we got to do was like and I think
एक second. Hello, ma'am. Hello, ma'am. Can you hear me?
Hello, Preeti. We are actually unable to hear you. I think your
yeah.
camera has frozen. Yes, I think there was some connectivity issue.
Okay, yeah, now it's back. I'm
Okay,
going to turn off my video because it's
okay, okay,
ideally better.
sure.
So what I was saying was one of the things that is interesting about radio is it's the space to have provocative conversations where you're not, just sitting and um, sitting with your guest or somebody you're interviewing and just tell me about your work, or just, or like really having a conversation where you're just getting an information download, but it is more of a dialogue. And dialogue is where, there is a back and forth, a conversation where there is also processing of that information and also challenging somebody. And I think the reason why these kind of conversations are important is I think we live in a world anymore that is very, very fragmented, right? Even social media has kind of put us all in our bubbles where we are only engaging with news and analysis that we agree with, or that affirms our worldview. And that really is actually not a good thing, because then we are unable to talk to somebody we disagree with or have differences of opinion with. So the art of really, dialoguing is something that really can, a good radio conversation can make happen. And for me, I remember in my early days, I used to struggle with that, especially when it's somebody you like or you're in awe of and you look up to. How do you challenge them? It's easier to just praise someone and ask them to talk about their work than say, okay, here's this thing about your work, but I don't agree with it, or I find this problematic. And having that conversation in a public space, I think it gets more people hooked. And there are people who probably would, you are educating more. And I think that's the work that I think needs to happen more and more, where we are engaging and dialoguing with difference rather than either rejecting it or calling it names and shutting it down or walking away from it. I think those are the things that are increasingly happening in across media spaces. So I'm going to play a clip from one of the shows that I did a few years ago with where I interviewed Meera Nair, the filmmaker, and tried to ask her about. And this is where I'm struggling to express a little bit of difference, or and I feel like now I would do it much more differently. Now, years later, I feel I'm much more confident about. Okay, here's what people think. People think you exoticize India to a Western audience. Is that how? What do you think about that? So things like that you can actually do, and that makes for interesting conversation. Okay, shall I play it?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
please.
You can play it.
Apex Express, Asian Pacific Expression. Cultural coverage, music and calendar, new visions and voices, coming to you with an Asian Pacific Islander point of view. It's time to get on board the Apex Express.
Greetings, folks. Welcome to Apex Express, news and views with an API point of view. On tonight's show, we spotlight South Asian films screening at the Asian American Film Festival, known this year as the CAMFest, from the Center for Asian American Media. That is opening as we speak. The festival runs from March 14th through 24th and brings yet another edition of inspiring and entertaining films, shorts, documentaries, and other programs.
Later on, we also bring you the voices of Sri Lankan poet Thirini Sundaralingam, and we wrap up tonight's show with a spotlight on Gujarat, slated to be the most developed or prosperous state in India, but which recently elected the likes of Narendra Modi, a right-wing religious fundamentalist leader and a documented human rights violator, to power in the name of progress and modern development. We are your hosts, Preeti Shekar and
RJ Lozada.
Keep it locked down here for Apex Express.
So that was an introduction. So clearly you can see that, I'm, the script, and it sounds a little like amateurish. I know it's a little rough on the edges, but it's also taking a political stance, like takes a very clear stance, which a lot of even independent media sometimes are unable to. And I think that is the power of community media or progressive media, where you can actually call out something as, who somebody is, So obviously, this is from many years ago when Modi was still the chief minister before he became the PM. So that says how long the piece is, how dated the piece is. I'm going to play my interview clip with Meera Nair as a way to talk about, dialoguing and using video for interesting conversations.
Make a political film without really censorship.
I want to preface this next question, which is a good segue for us, because I am a fan of yours, but we all, what makes good radio is also provocative conversations. And I was wondering if you could speak to how your films are perceived back home in India. What do you think of critiques that say that sometimes you exoticize it for a Western audience, which I don't agree myself because of being able to do this back and forth way of looking at life in India and here. How do you respond to that?
I thought that was an old critique.
Right. It's true.
Lately they like me.
Yeah. Well, also because you made Amelia, you made Vanity Fair, you've kind of expanded your...
No, I thought Monster Wedding made me, embraced in the fold.
Yes, true.
And The Namesake, which was a big hit in India.
I like Namesake. I didn't like the book. I love the movie, which I think is huge for a filmmaker because it's a struggle to make a good film out of a great book.
Yeah.
Can you maybe share your process a little bit of how films kind of can be made out of books without being intimidated by what the author and...
Well, I've always had actually terrific experiences with the writers of both the novels lately that I've been involved with adapting. Jhumpa Lahiri for The Namesake and Mohsin Hamid for Reluctant. Both are, I have to say, my greatest treasures are they are both really close friends of mine and almost family for me in my life. Both understood that, films are their own animal, and that if a film is another way of speaking of this book and not to hold on to it. In fact, Mohsin came on the ride as one of the first screenwriters with Ami Boghani of the adaptation because
stop there. It's not, it goes on to different tangents. A quick note about the format of the show. The shows that I worked on were like an hour-long, what are called public affairs programs, which means typically they are interviews or commentaries focused on show. So the other show that I worked on was a feminist show called Women's Magazine, and we primarily interviewed a lot of feminist activists, scholars, artists, filmmakers, and so on. And it was an hour long, so we would interview and cut it down and then mix it down with music and a host script, right? So every hour of a radio program would take easily upwards of 20 to 25 hours of pre-production work. Nowadays, you have podcasts with nowadays you have the whole podcast scene that has kind of exploded, right? How many of you listen to podcasts? Can you raise your hand if you do? I don't see anyone raising their hand. Okay. So are we all familiar with what podcasts are, right? Like, and podcasts are very easy to do it yourself. Great. So I see one person who just responded. So podcasts are a great way to quickly produce audio pieces, right? Audio stories rather. And I think the whole world of storytelling has kind of taken off in the last
Ma'am, can you hear me?
Sorry, Preeti, I think your camera is frozen. Can you hear us? Preeti? Uh, Preeti, I think your connectivity is lost. Hello,
yeah,
Preeti?
I can. Are you able to hear me? Yes.
Yes, now we can hear you.
Okay. I was just, so the other experiment that I've been doing is around in the world of podcasting, because podcasts have been huge in the last 10 years or so. And uh, there's India, in India too, the podcasting has really taken off in the last 3 years. Um, so one of the things I wanted to do around podcasting is use the storytelling technique to talk about Hindu fundamentalism, especially because since with the rise of the BJP and how much the diaspora, the NRIs as we call them, are hugely supportive of the BJP and the RSS, and in the US the South Asian community is a huge supporter of the BJP, right? So a colleague of mine and I were interested in trying to use storytelling to challenge the rise, the popularity of Hindu fundamentalism in the US and amongst the South Asian communities in the US. And the way we thought we'll go about is trying to reclaim the narratives um, that the BJP uses, right? For example, the Ramayana is a big trope of the BJP. We see that now with the Ram Mandir, and and the way they came to power was literally using a lot of themes and stories from the Ramayana. So one of the ideas that one of my colleagues who is researching the Ramayana is how do we subvert and reclaim the Ramayana and tell it from a different point of view, one that is not playing into fundamentalism, and also appeals to a lot of probably liberal Hindu voters who would ideally, if they had a place, would um, engage with being against the BJP and also have their religious beliefs affirmed. And this project became quickly problematic because I think, at a time when Hindu fundamentalism has grown phenomenally and recklessly, it's just hard to make the space to talk about a progressive Hinduism. It felt like one more example of a project that is washing Hindutva in a way, or saffron washing as they called it. And it felt very difficult to justify it, especially with rising violence that we see now unfolding, especially now in the second phase of the BJP in power in India. So one of the things we tried out, we had a limited edition, was a podcast called Nool, and Nool means threads in Tamil. It also means text. So Nool was an experiment to see, can we create a space to tell stories that will will enable new audiences to um, you know, uh, engage with the different politics without them also knowing, or without them feeling that they are being propagandized. I think one of the problems with radio often in the US is it's very quickly polarized. You have a whole bunch of right-wing radio and talk shows, and then you have the more middle ground independent radio stations, not independent, but at least like public funded with some corporate support, the NPRs, as they call it, national public radios. And then you have the left progressive radios that I was a part of. So how do you, try to straddle different audiences, tell stories that are interesting and compelling, but also reach new audiences? I think that's where I think movement journalism has a long, and hopefully an exciting role to play. I'm going to play a clip from the introduction to Threads that we created, my colleague, collaborator Anuj and I. So let me play that.
So, Anuj, why is storytelling important to us?
Well, I think there's a number of reasons, right? Preeti, we're both dealing with storytelling in very different ways. First off, right? You're dealing with it as a journalist. I'm dealing with it more as a storyteller. Myself as a performance artist, as a filmmaker, and I think stories allow us to imagine the world otherwise, right? And I think so much of what we do in scholarship, in politics, is critique, and we don't actually follow up that critique often with a vision for an alternative, right? And that's where a lot of politics fails for me, is in not having an alternative option. And so for me, that's where stories have a lot of power in helping us imagine a different world, because before we start to work towards that world, we need to imagine that world. And that's what, for me, the Ramayana does as a tradition. And as a tradition, given that it's been retold by so many people from so many different social positions, it allows for a pluralistic tradition story to arise, right? That is story that is also its challenge, that's also something that's completely unrelated to any of these things. So there's so many possibilities within a tradition of that sort.
Absolutely. And for me, the power of storytelling is both personally for me, it helps create the space as somebody who somewhat practices Hinduism, but but rejects a lot of the problematic part of it around caste and gender and sexuality. It helps me towards creating a space that I can explore, being the different hats that I wear as an activist, as somebody who practices the religion, somebody who is interested in alternative narratives. And like you said, like revisioning and reimagining the world, not through brand new stories, but through stories that we have grown up with, that we have a connection to already, and building on it.
I think it's important for us to both reclaim stories while retelling stories as well, right? Like we have to do the critique and the visioning both at the same time.
Totally. And then, and also in activist spaces where we all work, where those of us who work on different issues, we talk about intersectionality a lot, but until you really break it down to abstract, so racism, sexism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, Islamophobia, which is a rising phenomenon now, unless we really break it down through human stories and lived experiences, it remains abstract. So in that sense, it's valuable and important for me to be able to have stories. Has really enabled that already. We see those plurality of voices and narratives. The hashtag #MeToo movement is a shining example of how so many stories that have now come to light, which were historically didn't happen. There's a huge historical silence around how much violence and harassment and abuse has just gone down and gotten away with. Right? That is no longer possible now, thanks to storytelling.
I mean, it's also important whose stories we center, right? If we continue to center the stories of those who are at the center, then power doesn't ever shifts and nothing changes, right? For me, progressive storytelling or progressive Hinduism is one that is invested in actually making those who have been silenced to break that silence, right? To make it possible for all of the voices who've been silenced to speak. And that is, and for me, I'm not a practicing Hindu, though I feel like a lot of these stories lay claim to me because I grew up in a Hindu culture. And as a culturally, Hinduism claims me, even if I don't claim Hinduism as a religion, right? So then what is my responsibility then in terms of making these silences that Hinduism has facilitated, right? In helping break through that silence, what is my responsibility? Also, given the rising clout of the Hindu community in the US, this is something that is of relevance to us here, not just to those in South Asia, right? I mean, for one, the Ramayana is understood as a Hindu tradition, whereas really it's a South Asian tradition. It's not a Hindu tradition. There's Buddhist Ramayanas, as we've seen. There's Dalit Ramayanas. There's Persian Ramayanas. So how can we claim Ramayana as a Hindu tradition, first of all? And then once again, if it's understood as a Hindu tradition, what is our responsibility in opening that up, in not making it be a singular narrative, right? Like, what is our responsibility in helping maintain that plurality of voices?
Yeah, and as somebody who somewhat practices Hinduism and is deeply uncomfortable with the sexism and casteism that's steeped in Hinduism, how do we reject it? So this is that space that Nool, I think, hopefully will open up. Is can we imagine a progressive Hinduism, and what would it look like? Because I think too often we just are rejecting the problematic side without reimagining and recreating a positive way we want to engage with it or consider it. And in the process, I'm also open to the possibility that it may not be possible, but I also hope that the stories will help create that space to imagine or live, a more progressive Hinduism. For me, food is a big part. I guess I'm kind of digressing, but food for me, food is a big part of a lot of the rituals and festivals that we have. So can we just have the food, right? Like, this is something we didn't talk about earlier, but so that's why.
This is veering off into something else.
Yeah. I like the first recording, actually.
I like the first one a lot. There was some.
Okay, sorry. I think I played an edit round out, but you get the drift, right? Like, we sit and tape organic conversations where we first have a lot of conversations and then we edit it and refine it. So this was one iteration and then we defined it. So I want to pause there. At what time is it? Is it 6:30?
6:40.
Okay, I want to pause there. Yeah, let's stop there. I want to open it up to questions and and probably also hear from people on what what radio and audio stories mean to them.
Okay, thank you very much, Preeti. It was very nice listening to those recordings, both of them. So to the participants, you're welcome to actually post your questions, either post your questions on the chat box, or you can unmute yourself after I initiate this discussion with Preeti. Then you are welcome to either post your questions in the chat box or to unmute yourself and ask questions. So yes, so Preeti, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you actually raised a lot of interesting and important points, and you give us a lot of thought for, a lot of food for thought. I have a few questions and comments to make, partly out of my own, ignorance about, the field of radio activism and podcasting. One of them, of course, is maybe I was just wondering if you could kind of talk a little about the relationship between radio as a form of political activism and its relationship with the politics of funding, especially are you talking about community funding, community sponsoring? I'm sure that there's politics to that too, and also in terms of how different radio stations that style themselves after different kinds of political ideologies are often competing with each other in terms of funding, but also in terms of just sheer ideological control and manipulation. So I was just wondering if you could just talk something about about the politics of funding in the US, especially.
Yeah. I mean, in the US, there has been a lot of philanthropy.
Ma'am, you are not audible.
Radio stations will
Sorry,
apply to and get.
Yes.
Oh.
Yeah, I think I
So,
briefly got cut. Sorry, if you can repeat yourself.
Oh, am I muted? No. Not
I don't know.
really. Can you
I
hear
think
me?
I think it was just a connectivity issue. Yeah, please continue.
Must be good. Anyway, so in the US, I think there's a long history of philanthropy where there's a lot of funding. There has been, now there's that's all getting cut. But there used to be a lot of funding for progressive media, and by progressive I mean left of center. And the foundations would typically administer grants that would cover some of the basic costs. A lot of people who ended up working at these stations also volunteered their time. For example, I rarely got paid for the radio work I did, and it was a lot of work. I volunteered because they trained me and gave me the space of a show that gives you a lot of, like gives you the a lot of autonomy and independence to produce a radio show that is widely listened to. This particular station was listened to across the Bay Area, is listened to, and has a pretty big listenership, at least back then. Now we are competing with podcasts and other mediums for attention. But so a lot of the work is volunteer, and that is actually a problem because it's who can volunteer, right? Able to volunteer large chunks of time is also a privilege. And there are people who may be able to volunteer a couple of hours a week, but that's not enough to do radio. Now the scene is changing. Now there are more grants available. In India too, there's a lot more media funders who are funding podcasts, and the world of podcasting is subsidized by companies that underwrite through ads. um, and in the US, the right wing media is heavily well funded for obvious reasons. The right has more resources and are more unified, whereas the left, there's more infighting and fragmentation and limited resources. So who gets funding and who's not, like like you kind of you were right when you said that there's a lot of there's a lot of politics around it. Despite that, a lot of good radio has been made over the years, and it's a vital resource. A lot of the archives. One of the good things about a lot of the radio programs over the years is they have also gotten archived and are available to listen, and also be available as resources. A lot of stations use it as resources too. So in that sense, it's useful. In India, I think the podcast scene is rapidly growing, and there's a lot of companies that have made for like have raised funding, but it's still limited compared to you are never going to make a lot of money as a journalist of the time. But there are a few really successful podcasts and shows that get a lot of community. A lot of community also donates. Like the station that I worked at, we got a lot of community donations. That's because it was in a very privileged town like Berkeley, where there was, even progressives had money, and that's changing now. So that landscape is changing. So as times change, the dynamics also change. Funding changes, with cuts in funding to media and independent media. It's been really hard. I mean, we've seen how the world of media has completely transformed, right, with the internet and social media. Even like established publications, had to figure out how they were going to sustain themselves, from the New York Times and in India, the Hindu. Like all the major publications are still trying to constantly stay ahead of the curve, and it's not easy. So funding has always been a challenge, but I think what has been helpful is the whole democratization of tools available for storytelling has at least um, made diverse storytelling possible, and has with access to the internet, all you need is a laptop now anymore to publish your stories online, right? So so that has changed. But for traditional and independent media, I think resources have always been a challenge in one way or the other, and it's continuing, especially now with COVID and the recession that we are anticipating.
Yes, thank you. I also maybe if you could just talk a little bit also about the kind of relationship between regular radio and podcasting. Do you see a lot of because I think you briefly mentioned the funding, the subsidized funding which is available to and the corporate funding which is available to podcasting. I mean, which medium do you think is a has become a more effective medium, especially by virtue of its funding, but also in terms of its visibility. Do you have a lot of competition, or do they work together,
Yeah,
radio and
radio
podcast?
stations are producing podcasts, because radio stations are now competing for attention. Because back then it was only radio stations that produced audio stories. Now, the last 10 years or so, there's been a huge, proliferation of podcasts, right? There are over 6,000 podcasts in the US, and that we know of. And every day there are new ones coming up. Um, so the challenge is there, and a lot of radio stations also archive their shows. So in effect, they function as sort of podcasts. But the only way radio stations and radio shows, one way they are different from podcasts is around copyright issues and music, and different radio stations have different licenses around what music they can play, and radio. A lot of public radio has a lot of strict guidelines around language, like swear words cannot be used, and if you actually are using certain swear words and they get aired, you could be penalized for it, and heavy fines. But that's not true for the world of podcasting. Podcasting is largely unregulated, except if you try to get your podcast on iTunes, then they are listening to it for whether whether it has explicit content and things like that. Podcasting is heavily unregulated, and I think there's a whole bunch of podcasts. I think 90% of them are actually really bad, because it's just people producing content because they can, not because they've thought it through, or not because they have a strategy, and there is no consistency, right? Like, there are some podcasts that are like one episode will be 10 minutes long and another episode will be 2 hours long, right? So it's just very shoddy and very unprofessional and do it yourself. But having said that, there's also a lot of terrific podcasts. Some get a lot of resources and funding. And, some of the best podcasts out there that are widely listened to in the US, for example, they get a ton of funding, right? Both public funding as well as grants and donations and such, right? So it all depends on how you market it and how you are, your networks. So in that sense, I think it's still an elite world, right? Like, how many of us, if somebody on this group wants to produce a podcast, you can go online, look it up, and do it. But for you to actually make an impact, get resources, it's still, again, I think we rely on the old school, old world of networks and who you know and how you can tap into it, your social media presence, and all these other things that will help amplify traffic. So yeah, it's not easy. It's aggressively competitive. But having said that, as somebody now, I'm trying to get into Tamil podcasting. I think there's still a lot of scope. People are hungry for good content, so it's all about producing good content and then.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, I think also the regulation of content and what kind of podcast or radio station produces uh, good interpretive pieces is also very important. I mean, like, to what extent can a radio station take responsibility for what it says and what it does? It kind of has a
Yeah,
reputation, building a reputation sometimes, because I think now podcasts have also become more visible when they're being produced by radio stations.
true.
Otherwise, very often we don't know where to find the best podcasts or authoritative podcasts or good
Yeah,
podcasts. Because you're
yeah,
in podcasts, sometimes you also have that space and that breadth to be able to talk about something in great detail and not make it seem like it's just a superficial conversation.
yeah.
But it's
And
kind of
radio is a very powerful medium, right? Because of its reach, and it reaches places where even newspapers may not go. So I think radio is always seen as a very powerful medium. And India, I think historically, it was a very heavily regulated medium, right? Till the private radio teams took over, and even now, but they primarily, majority of the content is still music and pop culture and their topics, right? Like, how many radio stations in India, they are mostly not allowed to air any political programming, right? I think it's still heavily regulated. Once in a while, a show will sneak in something that I've heard, but by and large, they are not allowed to go into any political programming. So that's where I think community radio can be a big part in bridging that gap, creating a space for like what I call movement media.
What do you think is the scope of community radio in India? Do you think it has scope? What are the hurdles it faces, and what do you think can be done?
I think infrastructural costs, but there are, I was looking up state of in India, and it's fairly impressive, especially during COVID and such. There's been a lot of radio stations, small radio stations that have tried to, be a resource. Um, I think including in the Northeast, I was looking at how it is in the Northeast, but it's always a challenge around. I think through universities and university campuses have been a popular place for community radio stations to be set up and sustain. But I think now with the recession and everything, it's been really hard. So I'd be curious if any of you know or listen to any community radio stations in your local town or campus or somewhere. Um, Nepal has a huge community radio scene. There's in the south. There's bits and pieces. There's some radio stations that air very specific content. A lot of NGOs have taken to using community radio to, air more of their information that they are particularly working on. For example, women's rights NGOs, um, you know, would talk about specific issues around women's sexuality and reproductive health. Have used community radio. So this very target specific. But for a more journalistic community radio, I think in India we're still we're still not there yet. And I think that some of it is also around the regulation around how the stations are controlled. So that's because I think the government recognizes how powerful medium it can be for dissent if it's given, full autonomy, which I don't think it'll ever get. Unlike how print media or television media has opened up, right? Radio is still not there yet.
Yes, I think as you mentioned earlier, the radio seems to be divided between a lot of light, listening to light banter or music, which is fine. But then you also have, for example, Doordarshan and some of these other channels in the south, especially, which have been producing a lot of good, interesting, radio plays, interviews with thinkers, a lot of other kinds of discussions around music and politics, which is actually quite interesting. But then they have limited hours, especially early in the morning, when not seen as a peak slot. So only who are, maybe especially women who are working in the kitchen, or women who are, or somebody is driving at that time, then that's when you actually are likely to listen to these kinds of but I think a lot of them are not aware of it, especially before office hours, early in the morning. Lots of interesting shows that are not generally heard because it's not the. I also found it interesting when you talk about storytelling, multiple stories and a kind of a progressive Hinduism. I was also reminded of A.K. Ramanujan's essay, which got banned, on many Ramayanas, where he talks about plural narratives around the Ramayana, and how different tellings of the Ramayana, even what is seen to be the Sanskrit Ramayana, the authoritative text, especially, there are lots of instances even within those texts of critiques, internal critiques, and retellings within even a very authoritative telling. So it's or let's say a self-authorized telling. So I find that very interesting that you talked about how stories can be used, especially tellings of our itihas and epics. We talk about different feminist perspectives. So could you just comment maybe something on, maybe more specifically on your interventions with feminism? And I also know that from your bio note that you kind of interviewed Wangari Maathai. So maybe if you could just say something about your initiatives with women's groups and feminism.
My work with women?
Yeah, women, feminism, and alternative storytelling.
Alternative storytelling.
Alternative worlds.
I mean, around storytelling, a quick note is one of the things Anuj and I were trying to collaborate on was also looking at different storytelling traditions, right? In India, there's such a vast history of different storytelling traditions, and trying to surface that was something we wanted to do. And we abandoned the whole project because we felt like even talking about this felt like pandering a certain form of Hindutva, and we felt uncomfortable. And I felt like at some level, both of us felt like we were throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But, I think given it also felt like two elite Hindu folks trying to talk about reclaiming Hinduism. Didn't feel like an important political project. But I still feel like from a storytelling point of view, I think it's very interesting and useful. But talking about feminist, my feminist activism began when I, from a job that I had with a feminist funder called Global Fund for Women, and they are funder of women's human rights based in the U.S. And I was their communications um, point person, where I got to learn about all the groups we funded and write stories about them. So, and when I started, it was, like the world of internet hadn't started yet. And back in 2004 and 2006, it was like right before Web 2.0. And so it was all about writing stories. And slowly, once YouTube and all that came on, like then it started becoming multimedia stories, both audio and video. So I think telling those stories and constantly interviewing a lot of different women from different corners of the world. Like I said, I had to employ like one of the by what I meant by feminist journalism is having specific techniques to amplify the voices of women, right? Like, so sitting down and pre-interviewing and spending a lot more time before the actual interview is helpful to there are certain processes that you have, like where you can help them help your guest to bring out the best story. So a lot of times, sometimes we don't have the time. You just have half an hour with somebody, especially if it's a celebrity or a public figure. You get half an hour with them, and in that time, you have to squeeze in all your questions. So even in that space of time, then you do all your research and then have a pre-call, a pre-discussion before you actually tape or record or, and talk to them. That for me has been an important process of feminist storytelling. So you bring out the best in your guest. The other way is to also, have the other things are resource intensive, right? Like we are all doing this in English. I think language is a very it denotes power. So if you're interviewing, for example, whenever we interviewed Spanish-speaking feminists or those who didn't speak English, having a translator to translate it to English, I think that is important. I think now more and more feminist spaces are paying attention to talking to feminists who may not speak English. And also accessibility, right? I think one of the first things that we need is to get away from very complex jargon and rhetoric and using simpler language. And radio is that medium, because radio is conversations. Radio is not that abstract scholarship, that essay or article that we write. We don't speak that way, right? So how you speak and how you communicate becomes important. And the simpler and easier you are to understand, the more accessible you are. So so that's an important tenet of feminist storytelling. Um, and I think it's also hard to not insert your bias, but I think like I said, and that bias is sometimes inevitable. If you're going to talk about Modi and if you're not going to talk about his terrible history, the genocide, then you're automatically taking another position. You're automatically censoring that, and that is dangerous too. So not having a position is a position, right? So kind of doing away with the whole neutrality and objectivity, I think, is another important aspect of um, feminist journalism to me. Yeah, so I think these are some of the ways where we can tell stories differently, and also crediting sources, right? I think this is a big thing, crediting your sources, crediting your, if you're using somebody's photo, get their permission. So basic things that you learn as best practices, but I think it's more important in the current world, because so much of the internet is just freely available, right? Like Wikipedia is all about free knowledge. But free knowledge and having free knowledge is a privilege. But those of us who use that free knowledge and use it for our work and stories, I think it's just important you credit it, and or if you have to pay for that, if you have to pay for an image or something that you're using, do that, right? So just doing that ethically. So those are some of the ethics of in both just generally journalism, but I think along the way the internet has proliferated, we've lost a lot of these good practices. We're just virally sharing things now. Sharing is caring. I know sharing is fine, but sometimes it's good to credit and acknowledge sources. And I think that's important practice. For example, the whole Me Too movement that took off, Me Too was started by a Black woman, I think, and that now we've acknowledged it. But initially, in the early days, it was seen as some, Hollywood, like since a lot of women in Hollywood spoke out about it, it was seen as something that they created. But no, we know that a Black woman called Tarana Burke gave birth to that term and used it to talk about her own experience of sexual violence. So how we credit sources, it requires, and and any good storytelling will take time. So it's not. I think we also live in a world of like instant, production, and just to acknowledge that it's not. Sometimes things take a lot of time. And some of the good podcasts out there. This one podcast. They said that they take about 6 months to produce one episode, which is an hour long, and that's a long time. I don't think anyone has that kind of privilege, but just taking your time to do a good story, I think that's become a privilege now, I think.
Thank you very much. Okay, so the audience, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself, ask the speaker, or you may also pose your questions on the chat box. So questions from the audience?
Would anyone like to share a podcast that they like? They listen to?
Questions? Any questions from the audience?
Oh, Jay Shetty.
No, sir.
You are welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions if you like. All right. Is there anything else that you'd like to add, Preeti? Because I mean, our discussion can go on. There are no questions as of now.
No, I mean, as far as feminist podcasts go, I think there's a few out there. I can send you a list if you want to share it out. But there isn't actually that many. There's a lot more on pop culture and different issues of social justice.
Yes.
But yeah, and I think in India it's interesting to have like celebrities are taking on podcasting, right? Like I think I haven't heard of it, but I haven't I didn't have any comment about it. So it's interesting. The landscape is really growing. A lot of celebrities are taking to it. So so again, it's not. It's like who will be heard again is like it relates to our offline world of privilege and access. So just to put it out there. So as new forms of media emerge, old ways of being don't go away. So it's just, but it's important to it's great that we have these tools, I think. And so many things are virally shared so quickly. So I don't want to undermine that either, or understand.
Yes, yes. No, I think you're right about that. And I also agree with your point about language, because there's a lot we can do also in our own regional podcast scene or radio stations.
Yeah.
Because we know that in Tamil Nadu, there are quite a few radio shows and interviews on issues of caste, especially caste and female women, migrant laborers, labor, questions of agriculture, agricultural labor. I think there's a lot that can be done, because it is also, it's a medium which is very conversational, which where you can have a whole range of speakers, not necessarily from the academia, but from all walks of life. And there's also preserve a person's anonymity, which is useful. When you can hear them they are visibilized, but you can also protect their anonymity in many ways. So I think it's a very effective and broad-based medium, which is very, very powerful. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. So yes. So I think if there are no questions from the audience, then I think we can close our session here. Yeah. Thank you so much, Preeti. Really, it was a very enlightening,
Hello,
informative session.
hello, hello.
Yes. Yes.
I'm Ashok from Usmania.
Sorry.
I'm Ashok from Usmania. Hello.
Yes. Yes. Please ask.
See here, as the speaker mentioned, and you also quoted A.K. Ramanujan's so many Ramayanas. The story of representation with the world recognition and translation. Maybe it may touches each and every aspect of the human life. But whereas in case of a marginal storyteller, may not have the command of the language, as Madam mentioned that language is a political tool, and the content as well as the expression may not touch each and every person or anybody else of the world. So how can we reestablish or restore that kind of stories? Is it clear? Hello.
Could you get the question,
Hello.
Preeti?
Yeah, no, can you
No,
say,
here.
is it about the Ramanujam essays?
Yeah. See, many Ramayanas, by A.K. Ramanujan, may not, have that kind of touch of the marginality, because it is exposed to the world recognition, and it's an epic. It has the kind of language, nourishment, and many other aspects of its story building. When you look at the marginal storytellers, they may not have the language or content or the expression. So how we can reestablish or restore the traditional ethical background of the marginal voices? Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
We got your question. Yes. Thank you. Were you able to hear the question, Preeti?
Yeah, but I don't understand it. Like, how are you? The thing is the essay or specific to the process of what they, what this, what the larger conversation is?
Yeah, I think he's talking about storytellers, especially tellings of the Ramayana or any of these popular narratives from the perspective of minority communities.
Yeah.
How can their voices be visibilized? How can we preserve their voices? How can they be allowed to speak?
I think not telling their stories on their behalf. I think historically what we've done is spoken on behalf, right? The dominant or the elite have spoken on behalf of the marginalized. But we don't need to do that anymore. We can just make sure that they have the mic and tell their own stories. So that means being a good ally and getting those voices to tell their own stories. And there are some projects that try to do that through theater or try to bring alternative perspectives. But again, it's like resources and whose voice is amplified and how much.
Yeah. Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. Can you advise the funding agencies to restore the marginal voices, silence of untold stories, voice of voiceless, to restore their traditional, ethical, historical, and multiple background of the language and the content and expression? Can you advise the funding agencies? Can you suggest us the sources of funding agencies?
In India?
Yes, I think
In India as well as in foreign also.
Oh, I think in India there's the space for there are like foundations that are beginning on that. Like, I think the Aziz Premji Foundation, I thought, is like funding a lot of liberal and progressive causes. So that's one place to look into. And I think there are, I mean, especially now, international funding is very hard to secure because of the current government, and they have cut down access to international funding. So I think you have to look at, we have to start looking at funding within India for projects here. And thankfully, there is some. We have the biggest crop of billionaires, so clearly there is money. It's just that how that money is allocated is, it makes it hard to access it. The other thing I think we need to look at and develop a culture of is getting individual donations, and that's something that's hard to do. But I think that's something that is slowly happening. Like, I think more and more fundraising is happening on all these campaign, Keto, and all these online fundraising, crowdsourcing as they call it. The crowdsourcing has been a quick way to get money for funding for like small projects. If you're doing a small production, so to make that happen. So again, it's also about the networks you have, right? So creating it and sending it out virally and sharing it through WhatsApp. I think that's another way to get some funding. But yeah, funding is not easy. It's always a challenge. It's all about your networks and reaching out to people who have deep pockets and funders. So.
Any other questions from the audience? Okay. All right. Thank you very much, Preeti. We really enjoyed this interaction, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, despite your connectivity issues, but thank you very much.
I know, sorry. I don't know. It's supposed to be high-speed connection.
Yes, yes. No, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thank you, sir.